Welcome back to class. In this session, we're going to look at the major themes in chapters 1 and 2 of Daniel Jurgen's The Prize. Jurgen is going to begin his story in the 1850s in kind of the northeastern United States with this cast of characters who are going to come together to organize the Pennsylvania Rock Oil Company. It's worth taking just a moment to appreciate the momentousness of this episode, of this project. There really is nothing else in the entire world in the 1850s like this enterprise to create commercial quantities of petroleum products. And while Jurgen does a wonderful job of storytelling, and it's a kind of Keystone Cop antics, fumbling cast of cartoonish characters he's going to tell us about, in fact, these guys are coming together, and the result of their work is going to be the introduction of the hydrocarbon age to human history. Now, each of these characters represent a kind of type and a kind of function or role within oil production. And so what Jurgen is trying to do is tell us a fun story in the introductory chapters, but in fact lay out for us what are the major divisions within modern oil companies. So companies like ExxonMobil and British Petroleum have tens of thousands of employees spread around the world because they have entire divisions devoted to the lawyers and legal matters, and to the marketers and entrepreneurs, and to the scientists, the chemists and developers, to finance, investment, and capital people, and of course, endless numbers of engineers actually working in the fields. And in many ways, what Jurgen is doing through the personality types of these different individuals, he's telling us about the kind of character types that these different kinds of roles play within the modern oil economy. Now, the story really begins with George Bissell, who calls himself a lawyer. Now, that can mean any number of things in the middle of the 19th century, but he's really the visionary, right? He's the marketer, the entrepreneur. He's the one that sees the potential of rock oil to be a mass consumer product. And he initially has to go to Ben Silliman, this kind of college professor chemist who's really only concerned about tinkering in his lab and getting paid his $500 so he can get his debts paid off and get his wife off his back, right? And so Bissell brings to Silliman a sample of the rock oil, and really the chemistry involved here is very, very simple. Silliman is just taking samples of this kind of tar sludge material and heating it up to very precise temperatures, right? To 200 degrees, to 220, to 250, etc. And then seeing what kind of substances are excreted to the top, right? So I take the sample up to 200 degrees, a thin film is going to emerge at the top of that tar. I'll spoon it off, and essentially what I want to know is how flammable is that substance. And of course, he's looking for an intermediate point. The problem with tar sludge forms of petroleum is you really have to get them hot before they'll light on fire, and then they just kind of smolder, burn like coal, and that's not a very effective illuminant. But of course, on the other end, if you take off the very thinnest substance that excretes to the top, that is essentially gasoline and the highest octanes of gasoline, if you light that on fire, it's just going to blow up in your face, right? So that's not good either for an illuminant. So what Silliman is trying to do is figure out precisely at what temperature do I have to raise this ball of tar until the syrupy kind of substance that it exudes will hold a kind of consistent candlelight equivalent, right? Does that make sense? So that's the chemist's contribution. So Bissell now understands when he gets the report from the chemist that he does have a commodity, right? A material that if processed, refined, as we're going to discuss, appropriately, can produce a market product that will have a tremendous demand, right? A lamp oil. But now he has to go and somehow extract it from the mountains in Pennsylvania, and that's going to require an enormous amount of money, right? A huge capital investment to haul all the gear and tools, to hire the work crews and whatnot. So he, of course, needs a finance person, and we're introduced to James Townsend, who is an East Coast banker, right? He's based in New Haven, so he represents kind of the New York City, Manhattan stock market types who have to provide the financing to generate the capital necessary to build the infrastructure in order to extract the oil. But none of these guys would be able to achieve their dreams if they didn't find somebody with some practical hands-on know-how to actually put on the muddy boots and go out and walk in the field, actually construct the derricks and understand how to, organize the pulleys and the drill bits and all the rest of it, and also know how to organize and supervise the work crews of roughnecks that are going to have to actually perform the real work. And so we're introduced to these kind of basic types, the lawyer, the chemist, the banker, and the engineer, for us to understand that these are the essential roles that all have to come together and somehow cooperate, right? Somehow find a working organization if we're ever going to extract oil in quantities sufficient for it to actually be a mass consumer product. Bissell and Townsend are going to hire Drake and send him off to the mountains of northwestern Pennsylvania, to essentially the region between two valley villages, Titusville and Franklin. And they're sending him to this region because it's an area well known for having coal-dense mountains and fissures and cracks in the mountains where coal oil, as it would have been known, came seeping out and could be collected on the surface. It was known regionally as Seneca oil because the Native Americans for generations and generations had collected it and both used themselves, but also especially traded it with the white settlers for European goods. Drake arrives in Titusville with a pocket full of money and a self-invented title, right? He creates himself as Colonel Drake so he can command respect among the locals. But his main insight or sort of innovation is the idea to adapt very ancient technique called saltbore drilling and use it, update it. You have to make much more rigorous drill bits and whatnot, right? Much tougher drill bits to drill through rock than through salt layers, but to adapt that very ancient technology to the search for oil. And so he is really the innovator who thinks of the modern oil derrick. So he is going to hire a local crew, buy up some lumber and whatnot. He hunts around for patches of land that he thinks are the best spots to drill and has to negotiate with the local landowners for the right to drill. And he spends month after month after month drilling and drilling and drilling, continually discovering failure. And this is a kind of apocryphal story in the oil industry. You'll find this basic narrative repeated over and over again in the histories of different oil companies. Literally on the day that Townsend has been screaming at him, if you don't discover oil, we got to wrap up shop. The investors are furious at losing all of our money. And literally on the day the telegram arrives, close everything down, we have no more money, is the day that Drake and his crew hit a giant gusher. That, of course, is a wonderful story, but as I say, if you spend any time reading in this literature, you'll see that same story repeated over and over again, and after a while you get a little... It is amazing the coincidence, the number of times that happens. But it is one of the kind of... the willingness and the courage to risk everything in the search for oil pays off at the end when the gusher comes, and that kind of rags to riches story is really important to the culture of the late 19th century and really American, the kind of economy of oil and the business of oil. That kind of rough cowboy out on the plain, pulling themselves up by their own bootstraps kind of story becomes really important in the oil industry. So the oil gusher is a little bit like the gold prospector panning for gold, eking out an existence in the forest, living in a tent by the creekside, panning for gold every day. And the moment the gold prospector finally discovers that big gold nugget at the bottom of his pan that's going to make him rich and transform his life forever and pay off all of his sacrifice and hard work, that's a very powerful cultural story in mid-19th century America. And in fact, the California Gold Rush was one of the biggest events in the decade immediately preceding the oil boom in Northwest Pennsylvania. Now, prospecting for oil is considerably more complicated than prospecting for gold. Just like Bissell and Townsend and Drake had to pool together their talents and their resources, very quickly, dozens and eventually hundreds of other similar groups come together, organize, and take their shot at striking it rich in the mountains of Pennsylvania. By 1860, this region is going to produce 450,000 barrels of oil, and by 1862, 3 million barrels of oil. And consider as well, this is happening during the Civil War. When the Civil War concludes, the amount of activity in this region is going to expand dramatically. And it takes on a kind of boomtown atmosphere like the gold rush towns of the West. Little towns are built up very quickly. Land prices skyrocket as people come in and bid for leasing rights to construct their oil rigs, and you see this kind of in the images on the screen, this kind of forest of oil derricks. And the key thing to understand about those images are each one of those oil derricks is very likely owned by a different group or company. Or perhaps each one has built one or two or three as many oil leases as they were able to obtain. So a kind of Wild West, boomtown atmosphere pervades this whole region in the decades following Drake's great discovery. Now, once oil is flowing in significant quantities, the first major challenge, of course, is how to get it down out of the mountains and to the industrial centers, the big cities, that then can refine it and process it into saleable commodities. And this is going to be one of the kind of innate characteristics of oil as a commodity that is going to define the industry, especially in this early phase. Oil tends to be discovered in remote, rugged locations, so you have to haul all your gear up into the mountains and construct that oil derrick. There's no freeway and no semi trucks that you can drive up the mountain with your load of lumber and everything else you need. You have to haul all that stuff up there. By the end of this class, we're going to be talking about drilling in the Arctic Circle in Alaska and the challenges of setting up oil infrastructure up there, and also deep sea offshore drilling and pulling our gear out into the middle of the ocean and surviving the conditions in the middle of the ocean. Here in this first phase, they have to figure out how to get the oil down out of the mountain. And you see in the image on the left, dozens of different troughs or eaves. You imagine each one of those eaves is a long system going all the way back up to the land claims of all the different companies, right? So you see all these different oil drillers, oil companies, all bringing their troughs down to the lowest spot, presumably in the valley below the mountain ridges where they're drilling for oil. In the image on the lower right, you see larger vats being collected, but the same process then, that oil has to be put in wooden casks. Those wooden casks loaded up on wagons that are hauled by horses down the side of the mountain. You have to imagine how much weight are in those wooden wagons and the incredible strain on those horses going down the side of a mountain with that much weight in the wagon. It's a tremendous problem. The other side of the transportation story that Jurgen does a wonderful job of pointing out in his description of the oil wars is it's the first kind of conflict point where you see the kind of chaos and disruption of having so many different oil producers, right? So everybody is competing with each other for transportation costs. And on the other side, you have just as many different companies organizing the wagoners, that is, the guys who are charging freight to drive the teams of horses up and down the mountain. And that competition, and then the attempt by the wagoners to organize themselves into a cartel to enforce prices against the ultra competitiveness of having all these different producers bidding with their competitors leads to the technological innovation of the pipeline, right? And that's the image in the top right. Notice the construction there. It's literally being made with wooden slats and iron hoops to tie the slats together. They're in a fairly flat patch there, but you have to imagine that whole strip was covered with trees, so they had to be cleared and it had to be raked and hoed, and they have just very primitive grading equipment that can be pulled with horses over mile after mile after mile of mountainside. It requires an enormous investment of capital to construct a pipeline. Comparatively, you have all those small Wagoneer operations. A couple of guys get together, they pool their money, they can buy a wagon and a team of horses. It's a comparatively low cost of entry for those companies, but it leads to the chaos of the market. So it requires concentration of capital and the cooperation of the producers. The thing about the pipeline is every different producer company are all going to put their oil in that same pipeline. When you get to the bottom of the pipeline, there's no way to know whose oil is whose, right? So the producers have to come together and cooperate and produce the oil exchange, and we'll come to that in just a moment. But they have to come up with a kind of administrative system where everybody can get a receipt. I put in my 10 barrels at the top of the pipeline. My agent down at the bottom of the pipeline is going to have a piece of paper by which he can take 10 barrels out of the other end, and we can't argue about whose oil is whose. This is a recurring theme in these early chapters in Jurgen, how American entrepreneurship and the competition among individuals is part of that spirit of discovery and being able to make yourself rich, and that wonderful part of American culture, but it also produces instability in the market. And when it comes to a commodity like oil, that instability, that competition can be a major obstacle to consumers actually getting the product on the other end. So there's a kind of dilemma or paradox of American business values that Jurgen is trying to illustrate for you through the story of the oil wars and the building of the pipeline and the combination of the producers. Solving the transportation problem and being able to efficiently and cost effectively bring commercial quantities of oil to market only exacerbated the crisis of the early phase of the oil industry. And this, again, is a great paradox or dilemma that Jurgen is trying to illustrate for you here in these early stories that's going to recur throughout the semester. We have two charts here, and we're going to look at these and similar ones again and again and again throughout this semester. The top chart is a simple oil price chart, and it has two lines on it. The bottom green line marked money of the day is known as the nominal price. That is the actual amount that was stamped on the side of the barrel, $1.50 or whatever it said in 1861 or 1870. That is the price in the value of the price at the current time. But of course, the dollar fluctuates wildly in value, and a dollar in 1880 was worth a lot more than a dollar today. So the orange line at the top of the chart normalizes with constant dollar values. In this case, presumably this chart was created in 2009, so it's the value of the dollar in 2009 and every preceding preceding year adjusted against that value. So that's known as constant prices, right? So what's happening in that first spike on the left-hand side of the chart, when those first hundreds and then thousands of barrels of oil started appearing on the in the markets of Boston and New York and Philadelphia and the other big towns of the day, manufacturers and merchants immediately recognized that this was a miracle product, that they could, merchants recognized they could sell it very easily, that they would have lots of demand for it, and manufacturers were demanding as much as they could of this product. And so, of course, the price skyrockets in that first initial surge. It increases by some what is that? 500% in the first couple of years. But as other producers realize this is a miracle product and they're making insane profits with prices at that level, more and more groups like Bissell and Townsend and Drake come together, organize their resources and materials, and head up into the mountains of Pennsylvania. More and more oil is produced, and as more oil is produced and comes to market, of course the price plummets because there's plenty of sellers to meet the demand. In the case of oil, by the late 1870s, Jurgen tells us we're getting a dime a barrel. That is far less than the cost that what it costs to produce a barrel of oil. And at that point, the market is unsustainable, right? There is no margin for Townsend's investors to get a dividend on the money they put up. They are losing money even though Drake was fantastically successful in his mission, and that's sort of the dilemma of the boom and bust cycle of free markets. Now, the chart on the lower part of the screen is measuring not so much price, but price stability. How much do prices change from year to year or from quarter to quarter? And you'll see, again, we're going to come back to this chart as we characterize these successive eras. One of the things that marked this early period was not just this first peak and then a plummet, but the instability of the prices. Prices were constantly going up and going down to extreme degrees. Now, if you think of yourself as a business, businesses and all their costs, not just energy costs, can tolerate a little bit higher price if they can get price stability. Price stability is a very valuable thing because, of course, then as a business, you can forecast and make arrangements. You can know what it's going to cost you 3 years out, 5 years out. And one of the main characteristics of these kind of crisis cycle periods, there's one question about what is the price of oil, but there's a separate question about how stable is that price. And what we see in this first era is the most unstable price structure of the entire 120 years, 150 years that we're going to be examining. Overproduction is a kind of general trait of capitalist free market economies. One of the wonderful things about capitalism is that investors and entrepreneurs are so free to move from sector to sector in the economy as they promise greater or lesser profits. And this can create a very efficient system that is, sort of acutely sensitive to consumer demand. It's very good at delivering the products that consumers want. But in an atmosphere of open competition, there's very little incentive for investors to pull their money out right at the very peak to sort of extract maximum profits from the rising prices, but then to recognize and be able to quickly enough withdraw their investment before the floor falls out of the bottom of the prices and everybody loses their shirts. This is it's exactly the dynamics and the attributes that make capitalism so powerful that also make it so susceptible to this problem. Now, if this is sort of a generally true of capitalist free market economies, it is particularly true of natural resource extraction industries, sort of mining and lumbering and whatnot, and it is acutely true of oil extraction or oil production. Jurgen gives us in this first chapter several characteristics of oil production that make it particularly amenable to, particularly susceptible to the problem of overproduction. He discusses the rule of capture, which is a principle of American law that is actually rooted in the British common law, the kind of ancient British tradition. And the essential idea of the rule of capture is that your property boundary line extends essentially vertically up in the air, but not vertically down below the surface of the ground. So if the activity that I conduct on the surface portion of my property happens to invade material that exists on your side of the property line below the boundary, I have done you no disservice or no harm by extracting that thing. So you see in the image on the left there two drilling operations. One drilling rig on the left-hand side of the image and three drilling rigs on the right-hand side of the image. Both of those operations have a legal right to as much oil as they can extract from the common pool beneath the earth. Now, at the surface, the operation on the right could not add a fourth rig onto the operation on the left side of that vertical boundary above the land, but they can invade simply by extracting the oil. Now, they couldn't, sort of send their drill bits over on the other side of the line, but if the oil on the left-hand side of the line gets sucked up under their straws, then it's theirs, they own it. It is exactly this rule of capture that accounts for that forest of oil derricks that you see in the image at the top of the screen, right? The more oil rigs I construct on my little tiny patch of land, the more oil I can suck out of the common pool that exists under everybody's patch of land there. I have every incentive to put up as many oil rigs as I can. That is, to stick as many straws in the ground as I can within my narrow patch of land, because that patch of land was really expensive. Now, this problem is further exacerbated by another kind of idiosyncratic feature of American property law, and that is the development of oil leases. I, in fact, don't have to rent you or lease you the surface of my land, but I can still lease you the right to the oil that exists below my land. So in other words, I can lease you a tiny little patch, literally 50 feet by 50 feet, just big enough for you to construct your oil rig. And what that means is I can lease that surface land to multiple different people, because I'm not actually giving them right to the surface land, I'm just giving them rights to the oil beneath. And because of the rule of capture, I can then multiply the oil leases on my land. In fact, there aren't so many, farmers in the mountains of Pennsylvania, but as the story moves to Southern California and especially to Texas and Oklahoma, large landowners can become very wealthy, not by constructing oil rigs themselves, but by issuing multiple leases to different oil drillers to come and drill on their property. Probably the most important feature of the oil industry that makes it particularly susceptible to overproduction is that it is a highly capital intensive industry. And what we mean by that is the enormous upfront investment that you have to make before you can even begin drilling, and that you have to be prepared to drill and drill and drill before your first gusher comes in. You have to be prepared to lose in this period thousands and thousands, but eventually we'll talk about billions and billions of dollars before you ever see your first return. And so just like the story that Jurgen is telling here in chapter 1 with Townsend screaming at Drake, the investors are furious, if you don't hit something we got to close up shop, you have to imagine that on a larger scale with ExxonMobil, with millions of shareholders holding hundreds of millions of shares, demanding dividends on their stock, right? Because oil production starts out in the hole, they have a very strong incentive to sell as much as they can, even if they are reducing their profit per barrel. That's the key thing. Would you rather sell 1,000 barrels and make $10 a barrel, or would you rather sell 1,000,000 barrels and make a penny a barrel, right? So they're making less profit, even to the point of losing, but because they are so far in debt, because the demand on them to return something on all the money that's been invested, they have a very strong incentive to not pull out of the market even though prices are declining. That's less true of other kinds of industries and economic activity where you don't have to have so much upfront money before you can enter the market. Finally, Jurgen discusses the creation of the oil exchange, and we referred to this earlier when we were talking about pipelines. An essential transition that happens here is the owners of the oil rigs sitting up there in the mountains with their arms around a dozen barrels of oil, and the moment at which those producers were able to transform those barrels of oil into a piece of paper that says, I own 12 barrels of oil. In other words, the actual physical barrels of oil become totally interchangeable on the market, and ownership is the holding of, if you will, some kind of stock or certificate that proves your proves your ownership. And at that moment, now I'm looking at return on whatever I paid for this piece of paper, right? And I can start calculating that half percentages, three-quarter percentages. And again, it encourages me to push the very limit of those declining prices and not pull out, because I can calculate very precisely. I'm not down there in the mountains trying to wrangle a couple wagons full and roll up a barrel of oil in there. I'm sitting with an accountant in the oil exchange in Oil City, Pennsylvania, with an accountant calculating hour by hour the declining prices. All of that tends to energize the oil industry in a way that becomes acute. It becomes very difficult for oil companies not to drive themselves into bankruptcy. That's the essential dilemma that Jurgen is trying to lay out for you in Chapter 1. It sets the stage then for John D. Rockefeller and Standard Oil to come in and try to solve this problem. But you're going to also want you to understand that this is intrinsic to the oil industry, and we're going to see this cycle recur over the next 150 years, all the way through the 20th century. We're going to watch this same process of a desperate search for oil. We're running out of oil. What are we going to do when the world runs out of oil? A massive search for new sources, and then once we discover them, extracting every last barrel out of them at maximum production because we're trying to recoup our losses, and in the process creating an oil glut in the world and prices collapsing. So that's the broader theme that Jurgen is trying to introduce you to here by telling you the story of the boom and bust of the first 20 years. Jurgen opens Chapter 2 then by introducing us to John D. Rockefeller and his partner Henry Flagler and the organization of Standard Oil. They're going to first come together and start their business in 1870, and by 1882 they will be incorporated as a trust. By the 1880s, Standard Oil is one of the very largest companies in the United States, and by the end of the 19th century, it will be one of the biggest companies in the entire world. So the story of Standard Oil is not only a couple of kind of geniuses who come in and sort out the kerosene market, it's also a story about the invention of a new type of corporation in American history, and a structure of corporation that we will, in another half century, three-quarters of a century, export to the rest of the world. In these characters of Rockefeller and Flagler, Jurgen is introducing us to a kind of converse personality type. If the characters involved in the Pennsylvania Rock Oil Company, Bissell and Townsend and Drake, embody, if you will, the kind of wild west of American capitalism. These kind of rough and ready guys, kind of half con men on the make and half technological geniuses. In Rockefeller and Flagler, we see very different personality types. They represent the button-down, self-discipline, kind of waspy, if you will, side of American culture, especially in the late 19th century. These two guys are driven by the need for order and a kind of mission to impose discipline on their fellow market participants. They do not see the wonders of individual freedom and open competition. What they see is chaos and disorder, and it's their mission to create structure out of that chaos. So we're watching a kind of collision of American economic values when we see Rockefeller and Flagler enter the story and try to discipline all the other actors that we've been watching up to this point. Now, Rockefeller's great insight, his great genius as he looked at this chaotic kerosene market, was to realize that it's a fool's game to get your boots muddy up in the mountains of Pennsylvania and have to fight it out with all the other producers and the transporters, the wagoners, if you will. That those people who are out there trying to strike it rich, like a gold miner panning for gold in the creek, are just going to eat each other alive in their competition. And what Rockefeller saw was, I'm not going to go up into the mountains and fight with all those other people. All that oil is coming down out of the mountain, and it's landing essentially on the north shore of Lake Huron. Cleveland will become the great refining center. Now you got to think, we're in the mountains of northwest Pennsylvania. The shortest route down out of the mountains is to the west, not back to the east where the major markets are. We're in New York City and Boston and Philadelphia, where the great demand for kerosene is. That's a much longer transportation route. So the the oil is coming down out of the mountains to the west, and ultimately Cleveland will emerge on the southern banks of Lake Huron as the great kind of industrial center where all this oil is going to arrive. And it was Rockefeller's genius to see a fool's game up there competing with all the other oil prospectors up in the mountains. I'm going to figure out how to monopolize the oil once it's already come down out of the mountain. And so we're going to learn a great deal in this chapter about refining and the refinery business and the way in which Rockefeller and Flagler essentially went in and forced either bought up independent refiners or forced them out of business. Now you can see in these images just how simple or crude, if you will, the process of refining is. It's really not that more complicated than what George Bissell was doing with his little test tubes full of samples of Seneca rock oil in his laboratory. When you refine oil, at least in these early days, all you're doing is heating it up, waiting for the kind of light fluid to rise to the top, skimming off that light fluid into a separate canister, heating that up again to a specific temperature, waiting for the lightest fluid to emerge at the top of that batch, skimming it off into a fresh vat, heating that up, etc. So what you see in these images are these series of giant tubs, right, with heating furnaces, brick heating furnaces built around their base, and then a system of pipes that come off the top of each tub that are going to take that thin fluid at the top and let it run down to the next barrel. Refining is such a simple process that actually what's shown in the images here are fairly elaborate and expensive apparatuses. You could just, if you lived in Cleveland and you had a mom and pop grocery store, say, you could take your wagon up to the railroad depot and buy yourself a barrel of oil that had just come down from the mountains. And you could essentially in your backyard, if you wanted to, if you had a big copper kettle or whatnot over an open flame, and you could scoop that thick sludgy oil out of your barrel into your copper kettle, and you could perform essentially the same operation as you see with these giant furnaces in the images. It really requires a very simple technological apparatus to refine kerosene in these early days. Now, the consequence of that, of course, means that virtually anybody can get into the refining game, that there are dozens and dozens and maybe more of independent refiners all around Cleveland that is mimicking that same open competition that we just talked about in Chapter 1 up around the oil derricks and the transporters. Rockefeller is going to begin in Cleveland, and he's going to start buying up as many of these refineries as he can. Once he controls a significant share of the refining business, then, as we'll see, he can manipulate the price and drive the price down, which drives his competitors out of business. He calls that a good sweating. We'll come back to that in just a moment. But over the 1870s, Rockefeller and Flagler are going to slowly consolidate their control around the refining industry. The second critical strategy that Standard Oil engaged in was to control transportation, or the railroads. Now, Standard Oil does not build or buy its own railroads, but similar to the way that Standard Oil is consolidating, so too ownership of the railroad system is consolidating in the 1870s, 80s, and 90s. And the main figure you may have heard of is a guy named Cornelius Vanderbilt, who is shown in that central image on the screen. Vanderbilt is going to have a virtual monopoly on the railroad system, at least in the Northwest, sort of from the industrial Midwest to the Atlantic seaboard, as you see in the image on the lower left. Those are essentially the Vanderbilt railroads. Because Standard Oil controls such a vast quantity of oil, it can negotiate highly favorable transportation terms. You should be familiar with this, right? If you have to ship one small package through the post office, you're going to pay the maximum possible rate per pound for that little package you sent. If you have 10,000 packages to send out every single week, you're going to be able to call up FedEx and arrange a special price for you, because FedEx, or whoever's delivering your packages for you, because they know they're going to have 1,000 packages every single Friday, they can plan around that, right? They can invest in more planes or whatever you need, trucks, to deliver those goods, because they know they're going to have a constant customer in you. Then they can give you lower prices. And hopefully this is a familiar kind of economic idea to you. So the first part of Henry Flagler's strategy is to negotiate lower prices, but again, because they control such a vast proportion of the entire oil industry, they're able to negotiate what Jurgen describes as the drawbacks. And the way a drawback works is Flagler goes to Vanderbilt and says, I want cheaper rates for Standard Oil, but in addition, when my competitors try to put a barrel of oil on one of your trains, you're going to charge them an extra fee, and we'll split it. You can keep half of the extra fee, and the other half of the fee will come back to us in Standard Oil. And if you don't do this, Vanderbilt, then Standard Oil will stop shipping all of our oil with you. And you're so dependent on our business because we have such a vast quantity of product to ship that it is worthwhile to you to charge my competitors more and kick back part of the fee to me than to lose my business altogether. And that's called a drawback. So if you think about how that works, Standard Oil figures out how to negotiate with the transporters in a way that Standard Oil's competitors are actually subsidizing their business. So it's really these two key features of Standard Oil's strategy in the 1870s: to monopolize the refining sector, and then to control shipping. And over the course of about a decade, they are fabulously successful in both of those endeavors. Standard Oil is just one example, albeit a premier example and one of the most often examined example, of a broader trend in the American economy in, say, the last quarter of the 19th century, the first quarter of the 20th century, that we refer to as integration. In sector after sector, the American economy is becoming concentrated in fewer and fewer owners. Essentially, what Rockefeller and Flagler are doing is taking advantage of economies of scale. And you may not be familiar with that particular term, but it's very likely that you understand the underlying principle. If I want to make one widget, it may cost me $1,000 to produce that one widget. If I make 100 widgets, maybe I can get that cost down to, say, $10 per widget. And if I produce 1,000,000 widgets, maybe I can get that cost down to 10 cents per widgets or 50 cents per widgets. The more that I make, the cheaper it is. Now, it's still greater absolute cost, right, to produce a million widgets than one widget, but the cost per item will be dramatically lower. Now, why is that? In part, I can order my materials if I have to order copper or tin or plastic or whatever I have to order in order to make my widgets. When I order that material, the person I'm buying it from is going to give me a lower price per unit if I order more stuff, because of course they can predict their business on it, and it gives them the ability to forecast over long terms. If they know they have to deliver, say, 1 ton of tin to me every month, as opposed to I show up at their front counter desk and say, give me a pound of tin, I want to make a widget. If I order 1,000 pounds per month every month, then that company can plan and forecast for the future, and it will reduce its cost. There is also an enormous upfront cost in these industrial projects. So I have to build the same $1 million plant to produce one widget that I have to build to produce thousands and thousands of widgets. So the initial cost per widget when I have a brand new plant is going to be much, much higher than after I produce, year upon year, decades upon decades of widget. That price will slowly lower per widget simply because I'm paying off my upfront investment. So we call that economies of scale. That's the same reason why you will pay much more for one bottle of pop from the gas station than if you go and buy a 12-pack of cans from the grocery store, and if you go and buy a pallet of 20 cases of pop from Costco or Sam's Club. At each of those points, you're going to pay more absolute dollars, right? It will cost you more for a 6-pack of Coke from Myers than for a single Coke from the gas station. But the cost per Coke will be dramatically lower, right? And you should be very familiar with this principle. Now, we broadly distinguish two types of integration that we think of as vertical integration and horizontal integration. You see two examples of that in the figure in the top right part of the screen. Standard Oil is the classic example of a horizontal integration. That is to say, think of all the steps in the production process, from building the oil deck, sending the drill bit down into the ground, waiting for the oil gusher to come up, gathering it all together, putting it in the pipeline, getting it out of the pipeline, the refining, the packaging, until it ends up on a clerk's counter in a general store somewhere that you can go in and purchase a gallon of kerosene. If you think of all those different steps in the production process, horizontal integration attempts an integration at any one of those steps. So, of course, the example we're talking about, when Rockefeller and Flagler go into Cleveland, they're not trying to monopolize every single step of the process. They're just trying to monopolize the refinery step. If you can get a lock on one intermediate step, you can effectively control all the steps that precede it and all the steps that follow it, as long as those, the previous and the succeeding steps, are still busted up and there's open competition. Now, this form of integration is most characteristic of commodities like oil. If you think about what kind of product oil is, it only exists in very few locations, right? So in the remote mountainous regions of Pennsylvania, eventually it's going to be down in West Texas, that is, there is not oil everywhere. There's only a few select locations where you can derive oil. That means that the steps of processing can be relatively well identified and controlled. The classic example of the other form of integration, vertical integration, we often talk about the meat industry, and it was typically vertically integrated in the late 19th century. The difference between meat and oil is that you can find meat virtually everywhere. Every region of the country, almost every town, are going to have farmers and herders and ranchers who will be producing meat, so you can't isolate its location in one place. It tends to be a local industry. Now, meat is a good example of a vertical integration because, at least until the invention of refrigerated railroad cars, you also have a relatively short period of time. That is, from the moment you slaughter the cow until you're trying to sell someone a steak over a butcher counter, right? You have a kind of clock ticking because the meat is in the process of spoiling. So it's very difficult to ship meat from the Midwest all the way to the East Coast or the West Coast most in this time period. So because it's locally isolated, the entire meat process tends to be replicated and isolated from place to place, then it's easier and more advantageous to go into one single market, say Chicago, right? That's a huge meat market, and just try to monopolize each step of the production process within that one local market. And it tends to be that products that are organized like meat tend to be vertically integrated, and commodities that are more like oil tend to be horizontally integrated. Now, once you control a big enough share of the market, then you can start to dictate the terms of the market. You can start to tinker with and set the market conditions because you control such a vast quantity. And Jurgen describes John D. Rockefeller describing this as giving them a good sweating, right? When he goes into towns and tries to take over the refineries, what's the first thing he does? He buys a local shop, he brings in Standard Oil kerosene, and he drops the price. Standard Oil might even be losing a penny or two or a nickel or a dime on every gallon of kerosene they sell, but their competitors can't tolerate the same losses because Standard Oil is so big, because it has sales in so many different markets. If they go into, say, Detroit, right, and they say, we're going to drive the refiners out of business, we're going to sell kerosene at half the cost of what it costs us to produce a gallon of kerosene, Standard Oil can make up for those lost profits in all the other cities where it sells oil. But if you have a local refiner that's just trying to make it in the Detroit market, that local refiner cannot tolerate those losses, and not for as long. And so when you control enough of the market, you can leverage the market, which is another way of saying you can manipulate the price. And that's the essential strategy that Standard Oil pursues. Now, you may think of this as an unfair market strategy, right? You're using your size to manipulate the market to drive your competitors out of business. But it is the fact of size, right? It is only when you get to some kind of critical mass, some threshold of the percent of the market that you have to control, and that'll be different for different commodities, then you get a kind of turning point where you can actually set the market condition for your competitors. And that's the big idea of integration, or as we'll talk about in a few minutes, the rise of the robber barons. A second area in which Standard Oil is really a path-breaking organization, it's setting new precedents in the American economy, is in its legal structure as a corporation. Standard Oil truly is the first national corporation in America, and it will become one of the first international corporations. To understand the significance of the trust as a legal form, you have to understand just a little bit about the way American corporate law works, especially in the 19th century. In the American constitutional system, the federal government has no power to create corporations. This makes the United States very unusual compared to most other countries in the world, but this was purposely done. If you have some background in the U.S. Constitution, you should know that the federal government is supposed to be a government of enumerated powers. That is to say, the federal government is only supposed to be able to do those things that are specifically spelled out and granted for it to do in the federal Constitution. Now, this is very different than the theory behind our state constitutions. We think of states as having plenary or original sovereignty. That is the opposite of the limited or enumerated sovereignty at the federal government. So, for state governments, our assumption is the state government can do anything you can imagine any conceivable government ever doing. That is, it has all conceivable powers of sovereignty, unless there is something spelled out, especially in the state constitution or in the federal constitution, that specifically prohibits them from doing that thing. So, plenary sovereignty or original sovereignty is whole and complete. Those governments can do every single thing unless they're barred. Just the opposite principle of interpretation applies to the federal Constitution. We are supposed to assume, now many of you are kind of scoffing and rolling your eyes as you hear me say this because you know federal power has grown exponentially, especially in the 20th century, but in its original incarnation, its original conception, the federal government is only supposed to be able to do those things that are specifically granted for it to do. And the key place in the Constitution is Article 1, Section 8, which says Congress shall have the power to do, and then it lists 17 things. The power to tax, the power to create post offices, the power to declare war, to determine weights and measures, right? There are 17 things listed. And then this weird 18th clause that says, and to do anything necessary and proper for bringing into effect the previous 17 things. If you go and look at Article 1, Section 8, you will notice that nowhere in there does it say Congress shall have the power to create corporations. Many of the state constitutions dating from the same late 18th, early 19th century period do specifically declare that the state legislature shall have the power to create corporations, or, because we were just talking about original sovereignty, if they simply have no prohibition on the state legislature doing such a thing, then the interpretive inference is then the legislature has the power to do that. So in American history, at least for the first century, century and a half, the federal government is presumed to have no authority over corporations. Corporations are created at the state level. Now that's going to produce a very idiosyncratic, a very unique story of the development of the modern corporation within the United States as compared to almost every other advanced industrial democracy in the world. In the United States, we have 50 different states. Now in this time period, it would be somewhere between 35 and 40 states in the period we're talking about. Each one of those states can create its own rules for the corporations that exist within its own boundaries. And that makes it very, very difficult for a corporation created, say, in the state of New York to go and do business in the state of New Jersey. They have to get reauthorized as a separate corporation within the state of New Jersey, and New Jersey can impose whatever requirements that it wants. And there are widely different attitudes both from state to state and also from the beginning of the 19th century to the end of the 19th century. That is widely disparate attitudes about whether corporations are a good thing, whether we should have as many corporations as the economy will produce, or whether corporations are terrible, dangerous things that need to be strictly controlled by the legislature. There are endless debates across the 19th century from state to state on the role of corporations. In general, starting at the beginning of the 19th century, that is right after the American Revolution and the ratification of the Constitution, virtually every state requires a specific legislative charter to create a corporation. That is, you want to go into business, you want to turn your business into a corporation, you must go to your state legislature and get them to pass a law that says you get to be a corporation. This, of course, is enormously expensive and time-consuming, and as you might imagine, it tends to be those businessmen who are have close relationships with the politicians in the state legislature who succeed in getting their corporations passed. There tend to be just a handful, dozens and scores of corporations in the early period. Over the course of the 19th century, and as there emerge more states who are stronger advocates to have more corporations, we get what are called open incorporation laws, which is largely what we have today in the 21st century. An open incorporation law simply says, here are the rules for creating a corporation. Anybody who can meet these criteria can fill out the proper paperwork and submit them to the Secretary of State's office, and boom, you are a corporation. In other words, the state legislatures are not making decisions on a case-by-case basis. Anybody who meets the criteria are permitted to form themselves into a corporation. Well, of course, as you can imagine, this is going to enormously increase the number of corporations in the economy. Even by the end of the 19th century, there are still some states that are highly hostile to corporations and others that are very friendly and trying to encourage their formation. In general, though this is not rigidly true, you'll find those eastern seaboard states, New York, Massachusetts, Connecticut, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, are the friendliest to the creation of corporations, and southern and especially western states tend to be the most antagonistic towards the creation of corporations. John D. Rockefeller and his lawyers, their great genius insight here in and using this legal mechanism of the trust to turn Standard Oil into a trust is that it's a mechanism for getting around the state by state boundaries. They are, in effect, trying to create a national company, that is, a company with the legal rights that they can go from one state to the other and force the state to recognize their corporate privileges rather than having to submit to whatever rules each state has. Now, a trusteeship is a kind of obscure figure or mechanism in the British common law. It is based in equity law, and it is a form of advocacy that judges are allowed to create, most often in the case of widows and orphans and other kind of legal dependents. So the father of the household dies, the wife and the children are sort of left at the mercy of the legal system, and a court can appoint a trustee. It might be one person, it might be a couple of people, to be in charge of the father's property. They don't actually own that property, right? But it's theirs to control, and it's their responsibility to use that property for the support of the widows and the children. So there's this great irony, if you will, that Rockefeller and his expensive New York lawyers dig into their law books and discover this little mechanism and turn it into a kind of capsule, a kind of vehicle for creating one of the largest corporations that's ever existed in the world. So the key mechanism here is that John D. Rockefeller and the administrators of Standard Oil get themselves declared by a judge, and they can do it in any friendly state. So say they're in the state of New York, and a New York judge says, I appoint you as the trustee on behalf of all the shareholders in Standard Oil. That group of trustees then don't actually own the assets, right? The assets belong to the shareholders. The trustees are simply empowered to make decisions with those assets for the benefit of the people that they're responsible to, that is, the shareholders. So now, when we go from New York to New Jersey, say we're down in Georgia, we're up in Tennessee, right? And we're trying to do business in all of these different states, I don't have to incorporate myself within that state. I am a trustee that's been appointed by the judge in another state to act on my dependent's best interest. So Standard Oil, it's really a genius kind of legal construction. Notice what they've done here. They have created a claim of authority for themselves that transcends each state boundary. It's very difficult for a judge and a jury, say in Indiana, to render a verdict against Standard Oil when the shareholders that Standard Oil represents are spread all throughout the country. That is to say, the interest that's at issue in the case is not simply confined to some local town in Indiana, that when Standard Oil shows up in the courtroom, they're coming with the interests of thousands of shareholders spread throughout the whole country. So they have a stronger claim. It's not determinative, but it's a very strong claim against whatever the local law of Indiana is. But at the very same time, the federal government is restricted in its power to regulate Standard Oil, right? So you're creating this kind of corporate form that exists in a kind of parallel world to either the federal or the state governments. And it's the ability of this trust. So the key legal idea here is the trustees of Standard Oil manage and control without outright owning, right? In the way that widows or orphans might have a trustee appointed for them, and that trustee doesn't actually own, but has the power to buy and sell that property for the interest of their dependents. So that's the key legal mechanism, but the profound consequence is to create this legal entity, a corporation, that exists, if you will, outside the regulatory power of either the state or the federal government. And that makes the trust the kind of premier vehicle, the late 19th and early 20th century, for the first generation of national corporations. And it is this aspect of the trust that that's sort of, it's murky and it lacks transparency. You don't know who the trustees are. The court that appointed them are the only ones who know their names. So John D. Rockefeller is the famous face of Standard Oil, but there's no legal reason, there's no legal documents that Standard Oil has to file in which they spell out exactly who all the trustees are, etc. And they also don't have to explain all the different assets that they owned across multiple states. And it's this kind of secretive, plotting, conspiracy element of the trust, which leads to Standard Oil being described as the octopus, right? And you'll see that here in Jurgen's chapter 2. The octopus is both a thing with multiple tentacles, right? So everywhere you turn, it seems like every business is in the back pocket of Standard Oil because energy and oil is the foundation of so many different sectors of the economy. Standard Oil appears in steel mining, Standard Oil appears in, agriculture, Standard Oil appears here. So it seems to have tentacles in every sector of the economy. But you also have to think about the 19th century. An octopus in the 19th century is a secretive, enigmatic, mysterious animal that lives deep below the ocean. We don't know very well what octopuses are, and there's endless legends and lores from centuries of seafaring, of sailors telling the story of these great sea monsters that can come up and wrap their tentacles around the hull of a ship and drag it under the water. So an octopus, especially in the 19th century, is sinister. Right? It's mysterious. It's an evil underwater animal that you don't know exactly how it's going to attack you. Well, the octopus, as a nickname for Standard Oil, is really describing those key features of the trust as a legal form for the corporation to take. We'll talk much more about in the next video in chapters 4 and 5 about the role of the robber barons in late 19th century American economy. The big idea that Jurgen wants you to take from chapters 1 and 2 is this paradox of capitalist free markets. If we believe in open competition and individual freedom, and we want to have free markets, we see again and again that if there are no rules governing markets, the result is that the strongest actors will dominate the weakest actors. That is to say, free markets tend towards monopoly, right? The strongest person will control the smaller, weaker actors. And of course, having a monopoly control the market is not free because it shuts out individuals who want to enter in and compete. So there's a kind of dilemma of the way we think about free markets. Do we need government regulation in order to keep markets free and open to competition? Well, if the answer to that is yes, then government regulated markets aren't really free markets, right? And there's no solution to that. It's a kind of essential dilemma or paradox of capitalist economies. And what Jurgen is trying to show you here in this early chapters is that cycle or that paradox, right? We hate John D. Rockefeller because he is a billionaire monopolist who controls the entire economy. But if we don't have someone like Rockefeller and we go back to open competition among all the producers, then we can't sell oil at a price that will sustain those businesses and the market's going to collapse. There's no perfect solution to this problem. It's an intrinsic problem of capitalist free market economies. This economic crisis or paradox, though, is happening at the very same time that kerosene is exploding as a product and transforming our everyday lives. Not only kerosene lamps, which are enormously successful, popular, but also kerosene heaters, kerosene stoves, kerosene medicine. Right? There is an endless number of products that are coming out in the 1880s and the 1890s, which profoundly change the everyday lives and lifestyles of ordinary people. So there is this duality, right? We've discovered this product that has these amazing properties, and everybody wants to get their hands on it. But that very success, that very transformative effect is the thing that is driving these market paradoxes or these market contradictions. And Jurgen really wants you to hold on to both of these feelings. He wants you to experience the exhilaration, this kerosene age and these new products, think of this like the invention of cell phones and phone apps and how different life was in the 1990s as it is today because phone technology has transformed our lives. There's a very similar kind of technological revolution happening in the late 19th century. People are understanding the potential of these products. They are changing their modes of life and basing them on these products at the very same time that the process for developing these products and delivering them to market are creating an escalating crisis. So it's both the good and the bad happening at the very same time. They are intrinsically related to each other. And that's what Jurgen wants you to get out of these first two chapters. Okay, let's leave it there and we'll pick up with chapter 4 in the next class session.